Okay, so we are on lecture 5, Buddhism, part 2. So we left off on this question slide, so we will move forward. Okay, so now we need to talk about the spread of Buddhism and how different Buddhist schools evolved. So disciples of the Buddha were sent out to teach the Dharma. You had a king within the Indian area, the northern India area, 200 years after the Buddha's death, who converted to Buddhism, and he was responsible for spreading it throughout much of northern India. As it spread, even beyond northern India, it always mixed with local customs, like local indigenous customs. And as it mixed with those customs, some of it really changed in radical ways. The main branches of Buddhism are Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, and we'll talk about each of those. Buddhist thought in all three schools develops in these major and sophisticated universities. The most famous one is known as Nalanda. Theravada. Theravada really focuses on mindfulness. The word Theravada means the way of the elders, and it is the branch of Buddhism that you find in Southeast Asian countries. They study the early scriptures that are written in the ancient Indian language of Pali. The monks and nuns live a life of renunciation, and they follow mindfulness and insight meditation teachings. However, these features of Theravada are more observable among intellectuals and monastics. Lay people are more devotional. So Theravada, as it spreads through Southeast Asian countries, it mixes with local customs, and you see the original sort of Buddhist teachings preserved among monastics, monks, and nuns. But as it mixes with local customs, the lay people sort of turn it into something that looks more like a religion and more devotional. The Pali Canon, that's a large canon of ancient scriptures for Theravada Buddhists. It is preserved in the Pali language of ancient India, hence the Pali Canon. It's often called the Tipitaka, or the Three Baskets. And there's a focus on monastic discipline, Dharma teachings, and scholastic treatises. And those are the three baskets that are the focus of the canon. The triple gem. So Theravada Buddhists cite refuge in the triple gem, and the triple gem refers to the Buddha or the enlightened one, the Dharma or his teachings, and the Sangha or community. Mostly, the Sangha often refers to the Buddhist community at large, but it also refers more specifically, as you saw in the first part, to the order of monks and nuns, the institutionalized Buddhist segment. So one is to recite that they take refuge in the triple gem as a Theravada Buddhist. The Sangha. So they're revered in the community, the monks and nuns, and sometimes the community is also referred to the Sangha. Men sometimes, Theravada men sometimes take temporary vows as monks, as sort of like a rite of passage to prepare for marriage, but don't live out their whole life as a monk. Over time, sexism increased among monks despite more egalitarian or equal footing between men and women in the early scriptures. So patriarchy sort of infiltrates Theravada Buddhism over time, which could have come from local cultures. Meditation. The two major forms of meditation are samatha, or calm abiding, and vipassana, or insight meditation. Vipassana leads to awareness of dukkha, anicca, and anatta. Anicca and anatta are impermanence in just different ancient languages and different terminology, but it's like anitya was an earlier form that I used. Devotional practices of Theravada Buddhists. So temples, halls, and roadside shrines are present with images of the Buddha that you can put offerings for. There's a question whether this is antithetical to the spirit of Buddhism, to what extent lay people are being encouraged to sort of worship the Buddha, where the reverence is going into worshiping, when the Buddha said explicitly not to worship him. There's also commercialization of Buddhism at the temples and halls and shrines, where I actually went to a Buddhist temple in Beijing, and they were selling all sorts of prayer beads and jewelry and images of the Buddha, some for more manageable prices, others for pretty outrageous prices. And you could tell that the monks and nuns are making a lot of money at these sites off of selling these items. The Buddha, sometimes they get away with claiming that this is permissible because the Buddha did call for the commemoration of his relics in stupas. Stupas are like little sort of like obelisk-like buildings. But he said not to worship him. So where is the line between commemoration and worship? That's sort of debatable. But this is questioned and problematized within Buddhist thought. Images of the Buddha were not used until the 1st century before the Common Era, so like 4 centuries, but not standardized until the 5th century of the Common Era, 500 years later. So early on, it really seems like it's over time, as Buddhism mixed with local customs, it becomes more devotional, and you see more images of the Buddha and you see what looks more like worshiping rather than just commemorating. So the next branch of Buddhism is Mahayana, the great vehicle. And where Theravada is focused on mindfulness, Mahayana is focused on compassion and wisdom. So this is the form of Buddhism practiced in Nepal, arguably Tibet. Arguably, Tibet has its own branch known as Vajrayana, but it's debatable. China, Korea, Mongolia, Vietnam, and Japan. And Mahayana scripture is focused on liberating all sentient beings from dukkha. Sentient just means a being that's able to experience pleasure or pain. So the focus again is just earthly suffering and its cure. They accept the Pali Canon of the Theravadas, but they also accept additional texts as canon. And there are different canons for 5 different Mahayana schools. Mahayana is more diversified than Theravada. Bodhisattvas. As I mentioned before, a bodhisattva is one that chooses to be reincarnated to help other beings attain enlightenment. Like they have, rather than an arhat, is just an enlightened being. Mahayana Buddhism emphasizes the potential Buddhahood in all sentient life, that all sentient life is capable of achieving enlightenment, and the seeds of Buddhahood are present in all of us. In some sense, we are already enlightened in certain schools. Some bodhisattvas are available to those that are living for petitions, for help. So you have some Mahayana lay people asking for help from different revered bodhisattvas. And Guan Yin is a bodhisattva that's very commonly appealed to, and Guan Yin is depicted as a female bodhisattva in East Asia. So the 3 bodies of the Buddha. So Theravada emphasizes the historical figure and humanness of the Buddha, which seems more like original to the teachings of the Buddha, and how possibly, according to early scriptures, he wanted followers to experience him. But for the Mahayana tradition, the Buddha is sort of almost supernatural. The Buddha becomes this immanent presence in the universe with 3 aspects. And those 3 aspects are formless enlightened wisdom of the Buddha, the body of bliss of a Buddha, which communicates the Dharma to bodhisattvas, in the emanation body, whereby a Buddha manifests, like literally embodies, in countless forms to help others. So a major difference between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism that you want to know is that Theravada focuses on the historical human figure of the Buddha, where Mahayana turns him into sort of an immanent presence in the universe, something beyond just being human. An important Mahayana metaphysical concept is the concept of emptiness. So ultimate reality, quote, is not absolute, but the absence of a permanent independent reality, end quote. So the word shunyata or sunyata means emptiness or voidness, and it refers to this lack of permanent independent reality in all of reality. And it was a concept articulated by Nagarjuna in the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. Nagarjuna studied at Nalanda, that university I mentioned. And like the Anatman, Nagarjuna articulated how all of reality is a flux of dependent phenomenon. So that nothing exists in and of itself. Everything exists only in relationship or in relation to other things, which only exist in relation to other things, so on, so on, so on. So in Hindu thought, everything is this one substance, Brahman. In Buddhist thought, everything is non-substance. There is no substance to reality. All reality is like a dance without a dancer, like a song or a composition without a composer, without a musician. And realizing this emptiness helps overcome attachment to things. So that's kind of the point, is again, if the source of suffering or dukkha, according to the Four Noble Truths, is constantly desiring and craving things, when we realize all reality is empty, that kind of helps craving or desire to cease. So Mahayana in East Asia, it was transmitted from India. Buddhism was transmitted from India to China in the 1st century of the Common Era, and then through China, it went to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. So Korean, Japanese, and Vietnamese Buddhism has a Chinese feel to it. Major schools of East Asian Buddhism are part of the Mahayana branch. And many of these schools are influenced by traditions that were indigenous to those areas, such as Taoism, which is indigenous to China, Korean shamanic practices, and Shinto, which refers to the native or indigenous practices of Japan. So Chinese Buddhism is known as Chan Buddhism, and Chan Buddhism is a form of Mahayana. As I mentioned, Mahayana is way more diversified than Theravada, so we need to talk about all the different subsets of Mahayana Buddhism. And the first that we're going to talk about is Chan, or Chinese Buddhism. So Chan starts in the 5th century with a teacher named Bodhidharma traveling to a monastery in northern China. So Bodhidharma brings Buddhism to China. An emphasis on meditation and direct insight is present in Chan Buddhism, and it is the most successful form of Buddhism in China. Chan becomes Zen when it's transmitted to Japan. So Zen Buddhism is Japanese Buddhism that was brought to Japan by way of China through Chan Buddhism. And Zen Buddhists believe in direct mind-to-mind transmission of the Dharma rather than scripture, which is sort of similar to Chan Buddhism, emphasizing direct experience of truth. Zazen, in addition to being a fun word to say, means sitting meditation. So Zen Buddhists spend hours in Zazen. Another feature of Zen Buddhism is koans, which are boggling questions directing to realizing the interdependence of all phenomena. And some of the koans get pretty heavy and confusing, but deep. Another school of Mahayana Buddhism is Pure Land Buddhism, and this is one of the most popular schools in East Asia. And it becomes popular when there are dire political situations where corruption makes it seem difficult to believe that people can attain enlightenment through their own efforts. And you have to judge for yourself how authentically Buddhist you think Pure Land Buddhist is based on what you've learned. But in Pure Land Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhists appeal to a Buddha known as the Amitabha Buddha. The Japanese call the Amitabha Buddha the Amida Buddha. And it's believed that the Amitabha Buddha realized that human beings were not going to be able to attain enlightenment through their own efforts in this reality. So this Buddha manifested this pure land where if you're good in this life, and you appeal to this Buddha, you can be reborn into this pure land where enlightenment is more easily attained. And this land gets imagined in really creative ways, like when you're born in the Pure Land, you're born sitting in Zazen meditation on a giant lotus flower. So it gets really kind of interesting, but the basic idea is that this world, it's too difficult to attain enlightenment. So if you appeal to this Buddha, they'll bring you into rebirth in the Pure Land where it's more attainable. Jodo Shinshu considers itself the true Pure Land. It's in Japan, and in it monks marry, and you attain salvation or the ability to be born in the Pure Land just by repeating the name of the Amida Buddha, and it is the most popular form of Buddhism practiced in Japan. And again, there's questions about how authentically Buddhist this is because you're not really attaining enlightenment through your own efforts. You're attaining it through the help of this godlike Buddha that's bringing you into this heavenly realm. So, I mean, that's debatable. But I guess you're attaining it through your own efforts once you're in the Pure Land. It's just a lot easier. Nichiren Buddhism is also another form of Japanese Buddhism that focuses on enlightening society. Nichiren was a 13th century fisherman who emphasized truth as it is articulated in the Lotus Sutra. And in our time, many Nichiren Buddhists take long peace walks, and they've often been historically persecuted for maintaining the Buddha nature in all sentient life. Okay, so this third wheel, or branch of Buddhism, is called Vajrayana. And there's a debate as to whether it is its own branch or whether it is a subset of Mahayana. So it might be a third branch, or there might only be two branches, Theravada and Mahayana, and this might be a form of Mahayana. So that's debatable. Vajrayana developed in India and was transmitted to Tibet, Nepal, and Mongolia. And it is practiced throughout the Tibetan diaspora. So Tibet was taken over by the Chinese, Communist China, who didn't allow for the practicing of the tradition and sent Tibetan leaders, including the Dalai Lama, into exile. And they've been in exile ever since like the mid-20th century. But before the diaspora and before Buddhism was brought to Tibet, Tibet was previously home to a shamanic tradition that was indigenous to the area until the 7th century when it became Buddhist, when Songtsan converted to Buddhism. And there was a transmission of a tantric tradition from India that gets blended into Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism. So you can find images of the tantric Buddha in Tibet. And this is a Buddha that seems very sensual. Okay, the lamas of Vajrayana are just qualified teachers, and many Vajrayana Buddhists practice deity yoga, where you meditate on oneself in the form of a Buddha or Bodhisattva, since you do contain that Buddha nature, and that's a path, they believe, to attaining enlightenment. There are about 100,000 monks and nuns remaining in the 20th century, or by the 20th century, and then the Chinese, not today, but by the 20th century, and then the Chinese invade between 1950 and 1959. And the fourth Dalai Lama, the Dalai Lama is the political leader of Tibet and the religious leader. He was exiled and escaped to India, and Tibet is still under coercive Chinese rule. Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhists develop mandalas, here's an image of Tibetan monks creating a mandala, and it is these elaborate images that are supposed to represent maps of the cosmos and maps of ultimate reality in like symbolic ways. And they're made by very carefully tapping on a pipe that releases a few grains of sand at a time. And it is immensely time-consuming, and it requires intense concentration. But they create these mandalas. This one is particularly vibrant. And then what they do when they finish it is destroy it. And that's because, again, in Buddhist thought, everything is impermanent. You shouldn't get too attached to anything. So it's an exercise in how everything is fleeting, nothing lasts forever, and to have the right intellectual and emotional posture towards that reality. Buddhist festivals. The most famous one that I'll mention is Vesak, and for Theravada Buddhists, Vesak marks the Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and death, and for Mahayana Buddhists, it marks just his enlightenment. So questions. Why is Buddhism considered a non-theistic tradition? You'd have to know what non-theism means, how it differs from atheism, how it's just not saying either way whether there's a God, but not requiring to appeal to the existence of a God to answer major existential questions. What are the major differences between the Theravada and Mahayana traditions? The main difference you want to articulate is how they conceptualize the Buddha. So Theravada Buddhists focus on the historical Buddha and the Buddha's humanness, whereas for Mahayana Buddhists, the Buddha becomes this immanent presence in the universe that can be appealed to. Think about how sort of supernatural the Buddha's power is in the different forms of Pure Land that you find in Mahayana. It'd be important to be able to articulate these distinctions. And do you think Buddhism is more of a philosophy or a religion? I mean, it's up to you how you want to answer this, as long as you justify your reasoning. However, it seems that like it's a philosophy to the extent that its focus is on earthly suffering and its cure. But over time, as it spreads to different areas and mixes with local customs, lay people do seem to approach Buddhism with a more devotional posture that could be described as religious. Some of the Pure Land forms look really religious. So it really depends on what type of Buddhism you're talking about. It's an immensely diverse tradition. We have a few more slides. So Buddhism in the West. Quote, Buddhism is often embraced by people in the West because they long for peace of mind in the midst of a chaotic materialist life. So there's been sort of in our fast-paced, globalized consumer society a revived interest in Buddhism in the West. Buddhism is being used in psychotherapy, and there are questions of whether these are new forms of Buddhism and to what extent they are authentic. There is a form of secular Buddhism. If you're interested in understanding secular Buddhism, there's Stephen Batchelor's Buddhism Without Beliefs, where he articulates that a secular Buddhism that doesn't believe in rebirth and some of the Hindu metaphysical concepts like rebirth, karma, whatever, that just thinking about it as a philosophy that approaches the problem of suffering is its most authentic version, not just like a new Western mutation of it, but is actually the most authentic form of Buddhism. So those are some issues to consider. Socially engaged Buddhism. Quote, an emerging focus in contemporary Buddhist practice is the relevance of Buddhism to social problems. Contrary to popular assumptions, the Buddha did not advise people to permanently leave society to seek their own enlightenment. So sometimes Buddhism gets mischaracterized as a tradition that's overly individualistic and not concerned with this world enough and or the community and its suffering. And that's not always the case. Often spiritual and political leaders are one. So you have the Dalai Lama or the king in Thailand. Often Buddhists have been involved in anti-war movements such as Vietnam. You had monks like Thich Nhat Hanh protest the war and get involved. And here's a quote that sort of explains why Buddhists would be socially conscious. Quote, they believed that all life is precious and interdependent. Violence and suffering affect everyone. So again, given the interconnectedness of all reality and the desire to end suffering in all its forms, it's not surprising that a lot of forms of Buddhism are very socially engaged. Buddhists tend to be guided by Buddhist principles of nonviolence, compassion, and social justice. They're invested in issues concerning social injustice, oppression, famine, cruelty to animals, nuclear testing, warfare, and environmental devastation. In Taiwan, there's a Buddhist goal of turning this world into a pure land, rather than escaping this world to a different pure land. In India, Buddhism has always been used to fight caste persecution. With all that said, however, Buddhists don't totally have their hands clean when it comes to violence. In Myanmar, which is a country formerly known as Burma, it's a Buddhist country, and there is a minority of Muslims known as the Rohingya Muslims. And right now, today, in late 2017, the Buddhist majority country has been basically launching an ethnic cleansing or genocide against the Muslim minority in Myanmar. And it's a major human rights violation, and their civil government is covering it up right now. Journalists are being detained by Myanmar to cover it up for exposing it, and it's a huge human rights violation. So Buddhists are capable of violence as well. Some final questions. What is the relationship between Buddhism and Hinduism? Similarities and differences. So this has appeared twice. It's probably one that you should be able to answer. The summary is that the Buddha taught an alternative to ritual-oriented Brahmanism of Hinduism. The similarities are several metaphysical concepts such as karma, samsara, so on and so forth. Differences, a major one would be the Atman and the Anatman, and the Buddhist concept of emptiness juxtaposed with the Hindu belief that everything is one substance or Brahman. What factors do you think may account for the growing popularity of Buddhism in Western societies? So mindfulness is really popular, and that's probably counteracting how our lives are being more and more saturated with media and flashy attention-getting media, and so we're trying to go back to some more focused way of life. So that could be one reason. You could sort of answer this question however you feel, as long as it makes sense to you. Is Buddhism best described as a religion or a philosophy? Both or neither. So with the exception of the Hindu metaphysical concepts of karma and samsara, Buddhism does look a lot more like a philosophy in the beginning that's focused on earthly suffering and this cure. Later on, though, as it blends with local customs, it does look more devotional in certain parts of the world when you're looking specifically at lay people. Why is Buddhism described as a non-theistic tradition? You need to describe again what non-theism means, that it's how it differs from atheism, and be able to articulate all that. And you should be able to do that by now. Okay. And that is the end of lecture PowerPoint 5 on Buddhism. So please post 2 questions or comments, or a question and a comment on the discussion board.